Hello, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on when you're joining from. We're going to let folks trickle in here, but yeah, thank you all for making the time to join this webinar. We a couple of house keeping rules. We encourage active participation. We'll have some polls, nothing too fancy, but we'll be asking you to drop your responses in the chat. And we'd love to hear questions, thoughts, comments as we go into this meaty and I think near and dear topic for a lot of us, revenue planning. So just hang on tight, and we'll be back here in a second.
Yeah, Quang, we'll have to figure out how to play music. I think that would be the only missing piece. But yeah, we'll probably the last webinar, we usually about 2-3 minutes in, we had kind of a critical mass. So I think we'll probably get started in another minute or two, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Awesome. It looks like I see some familiar names. We have folks from New York and Chicago, a lot of folks, even some folks from Canada. So yeah, really great to see all the names of people I know and recognize. Thank you all for making the time.
Yeah, likewise. I see a few Chicago folks have joined.
Anyone dressing up for anything fun this Halloween and want to share it in your in the chat? My son is dressing up as a Saja boy from the extremely popular Netflix movie Huntrix, which I've now watched probably 12 times. Billy Madison. That's a good one, Carmen. That's a good one.
There's a video going around of this. For those of you that know Billy Madison and remember it, what's when he's walking down the stairs and that song comes on and he starts singing. They have that that video has been circulating, so it was my inspiration for Halloween. And it's easy too because you just wear like a t-shirt and an old sweatshirt, so nothing bad.
Awesome. All right, we'll give it one more minute and we'll jump right in. The Cookie Monster. Oh, that's a good one. That's a one. Now, will you be giving out cookies, Ross, in addition to consuming said cookies? I assume that is a yes. May not want to admit it, but a yes.
All right, looks like we're getting, I'd say maybe one more minute we can get started. It looks like we got maybe about a 40% of people that registered, so.
Okay. All right. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into it. So again, just a quick reminder, housekeeping rules. Feel free, for anyone that just joined, thank you for joining. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, thoughts into the chat. We want this to be engaging. We want this to be useful. You will receive both the recording of this session as well as the slide materials afterwards. We also have a couple of Easter eggs. One, you might have seen our complete guide to all things quota setting that was shared yesterday, and we'll also have another call it a surprise for you in our Halloween theme event. But let's jump right into it. So on the line, who do you have here? You have Carmen Olmetti, founder of RevEng, and someone who's brings a ton of experience to this topic, not from only the perspective of someone who's consulted for companies on revenue planning, but also has lived with it. Has lived with IT budgets and allocated across the sales stack, has lived with understanding how to drive the type of pay for performance outcomes that teams want and expect from the planning process, and has kind of pulled it all together. And so he's going to lead us through really the integrated way of looking at planning, so it becomes an exercise that's not just an academic one, but one that really drives the results and the culture that we want. For those that don't know me, my name is Quang, also partner here at RevEng, and I've had the real honor of living, call it multiple lives. I've been a consultant for a very long time, going on now almost 14 years. But I've also worked in finance. I've also worked in product marketing, And I've always thought about this planning process and wondered, gosh, there's got to be a better way, right? And planning, for those of you that are going through it now, or those who are lucky enough to go through it, it's not always the easiest process, right? And in many ways, it's a process that's can become harder because of the advancements in AI and just the rate of change that's happening in the market. As a stat, we've seen the planning process, companies do long-term planning typically over a 3-year horizon now, shrink to 18 months and even 12 months because things are moving so fast. The information that you get and that enables you to make smart decisions is rapidly evolving, which puts a ton of pressure on this process. And we're here to help you think through, how to do this in the best possible way, again, for yourself and the teams that you support. About RevEng, I kind of already shared it. We're a consulting firm. We focus on all things revenue growth, everything from segmentation, quota design, comp design, the governance. But I think most importantly, at our heart and our DNA is we're operators. Where most consultants stop, we really sort of double down to make sure that whatever we come up with leads to results, not just recommendations. So a couple of stats, and this is just this sort of level set on why this topic is so important, right? And I think these are particularly important because in some ways they're kind of staggering. The first one, roughly 43% of sales reps as of about 2 years ago hit their quota, right? And so what we have traditionally seen as a dynamic where ideally 60-ish% have hit has come down significantly. What's driving that, I think, is the pressure on salespeople, the hyper competitive nature of the market, and two, just the elevated costs of really good salespeople, right? And so that's creating a reality where you're having arguably more losers than winners, right? And so as someone who's responsible for planning, responsible for setting the quota, responsible for setting the number, to be able to turn to your sales leader and say, hey, why did half the people not make it? You need to have a very clear methodology to defend those numbers. Turnover is hovering across sort of all industries around 30%, which might not be a bad number if you're and depending on the type of culture you have, and Carmen will go through that later. But over half of sales leaders that were polled on this said that this turnover rate is directly impacting the ability of teams from meeting their sales and revenue goals. So if you compound 1 and 2, majority of reps, or at least half, aren't hitting numbers. Turnover is significant, about a third, and that driving the ability or hindering the ability of sales leaders to hit the number is a significant issue. And the third one, which is the one that I had to double check, triple check last night, which is 91% of companies fail to achieve 80% or more of their quota as a team. So I would say that 91% of companies fail to achieve 80% or more of their quota as a team. And so no surprise, this could lead to a lot of bad behaviors. This can lead to resentment. It can lead to unwanted turnover. And again, as the folks that are responsible for planning, the question that we all have to answer is, if these are the realities, how do we best structure a plan that is both financially the right thing for our company, but also the right thing for the folks that work for us. All right. So first poll. So if folks wouldn't mind, describe your planning process in one word. And again, just drop it in the chat, and would love to hear what the audience has to say. And I'll drop in mine as well. Hectic, painful, rushed. I'm going to take a slightly positive, non-existent, always late. Oh, I'm going to go positive. I'm going to say exhilarating if I could spell this right. You know what? Just go. Everyone has an opinion. Not super transparent. Yep. Yeah. And what, before I lead it over to Carmen, as you can imagine, that's not what for something you do every year, that is the foundation for how you allocate resources, how you make investments, for how you deploy your team. These shouldn't be the words that are used, right? And so It's not to say that, their goal should be perfection, but the goal, I think, should be progress and better. And that's what Carmen's going to take us through next. CFO versus CRO. That's a really good one. That's a really good one.
That's particularly acute in large enterprises where margins matter a lot. Cool. Well, thanks for, so as Quang mentioned, appreciate all of you joining and appreciate the first audience poll. It's not surprising that there's a little bit of heartburn that we'll call it with the planning process, and we'll kind of see why that is. So some of this is just sort of, it just is. There's a lot of different teams involved in planning, and so of course that friction is inevitable in some ways. So it's really about understanding what those teams are, what they do, what they should do, what they shouldn't do, and then executing accordingly. But we'll kind of get into more of that. Before I go through the purpose today, I did want to make one comment on the stats, because again, I had to triple check some of these too as we were going through. And of course, we have our own experience with this, but the one on the current state reality where 43% of reps hit their quota, I think there's an important distinction there. That's the entire population. So that includes folks that are on a direct plan, like a traditional AE that has just what we would call an organic quota, but it also includes overlay roles like product specialists, engineers, even managers. And so when you separate those two, almost always what you see is that the AEs, those direct quota carrying roles, typically are at like 30%. And what pulls up the distribution, or we would call the participation rate, would be those overlay roles, where the ability to achieve their quota is a bit easier because it's such a large number. It's more of a portfolio number as opposed to hey, you're an AE, you need to bring in, 850,000 in new revenue in Q1 and 850,000 in Q2. So I think that's an important distinction. The second point before I get into it is the quota guide that we sent. It does speak to in great detail how to set quotas, but it's also designed for a practitioner mindset and for cross-functional partners, because it speaks to the consequence of getting it wrong, both from a financial perspective, which the CFO, would care about, as well as a talent perspective, which sales leaders care about. And of course, the overall talent strategy with your CHRO, they would care about. So do what I would do. I would just upload it in the chat GPT and say, give me a 500-word summary, because it is about 55 pages. But if you're on an airplane and the Wi-Fi doesn't work, which if you fly United, that's pretty common, you can, have something to kill time.
Yeah.
Cool.
Or if you need help with insomnia and yeah.
I thought it was pretty well written. Cool. So in terms of the webinar today, again, we want to make it interactive. We do have a couple polls, but of course, feel free to use the chat, comment. Thank you for those who've started doing that. Really, what we're going to talk about today is sort of the framework for strategic planning, how to make it a little less painful, maybe a bit more exhilarating, as Quang is hoping. There's a couple self-assessments that we'll walk through. And then, of course, there's the implementation side of it. And that's really, I think, where probably a lot of the frustration stems from. It's because, you have discrete teams working on discrete items that eventually has to come together. I sort of like it to a group project in whether it's in high school or college, where you have 5 or 6 people and you always assign that one person to put it all together. That's sort of what happens here, is that one person doesn't usually pull their weight. One person is a little bit late. One person doesn't communicate all that well. And then the person that has to put it together usually waits until the last minute and is like, none of this makes sense, right? And so that's generally, what we're going to try to avoid with having some sort of like governance structure around the webinar. And then, as Quang mentioned, I don't know if Easter egg is the right term, but we have a workbook that we're going to send you all that shows how this is all interconnected. It's not going to be the workbook you can use if you have 100 million, 200 million plus organization, but it'll at least give you the framework to kind of understand and see visually and conceptually how these pieces fit together. All right. So with that, let's talk about revenue planning and kind of the foundation of why some of this is challenging. So on the next slide, Quang, there's really 5 kind of areas that constitute revenue planning. And then you have an overall governance side of things. And so you can see you have market opportunity, territory design, setting quotas, capacity planning, and then comp design. there's different teams here, right? You have a combination of typically sales ops or rev ops, HR, strategy team, whether that's a biz ops team or an FP&A team. It's usually both. You have HRBPs, you have comp leaders. And so you can see that each of these have their own, I think there's hey, Quang, if you wouldn't mind muting, I think there's a bit of an echo when I'm talking. Sorry. So you can see that there's a lot going on here where just, speaking from someone who's played in really all of these functions, I can tell you, as the person designing territories and designing the compensation, I often had in big organizations, global ones, very little visibility into how FP&A set a geo number or a market number. And more often than not, when FP&A sets the number, and I'm curious if, for those of you that have been in the situation, would love to have you comment in the chat. It's not necessarily based, like, let's take EMEA, for example. EMEA is a really good example where, depending on the company, you might have 15 to 30 or even up to 40. There's, roughly 40 or so countries in EMEA where you get an EMEA number. And then you're asked to kind of manage that down to the market level or to the country level. And it's just the number you get is at an EMEA level, and it doesn't necessarily take in the opportunity of, say, the Nordics versus the Benelux versus, the Balkans or the Baltics. And so that's where kind of things start breaking down, is that you're given a number that doesn't necessarily reflect the true opportunity in the market, or it's at such a high level that it obfuscates the actual opportunity at a market level, which is that level of detail you need to set fair quotas so that more than 30% of people are hitting their number, and to make sure that they're being compensated, right? Because if you have a quota that is unattainable, then the most competitive comp is kind of not competitive, right? As we'll see. So that's really this slide in a nutshell. The planning process, the next slide here, is really the workflow that should be followed. And it interconnects those 5 areas. So there's a foundational side of things, there's a design, there's a launch, and then there's optimize. And I think what oftentimes is missing is the foundation. I think teams independently do a really good job designing for what they need to design for. So as an example, I get a number from FP&A. I'm the RevOps leader responsible for quota setting. I have a process, right? Now that process may not be the right one, but I have one. And so whenever that deadline is, I give a quota. The challenge with that is when that quota comes to, say, the comp team or to the HRBPs that, have to make sure that the quotas are somewhat attainable, because otherwise you run into turnover issues and attrition issues. There's not a lot of visibility in how that number was arrived at, right? And so there's not the ability to scrutinize it in a way that it probably needs to be scrutinized. And I would say that the fact that 91% of companies fail to hit 80% or more gives credence to the fact that this needs to be scrutinized a bit more. And so what we actually advocate for in planning process is sort of a center of excellence, right? Kind of akin to like a business transformation office. So you have one individual, or a team rather, that is responsible for all of this. And there's sort of a laddering from the different teams, because that team, they can be responsible for understanding those nuances. And that's typically where you see a RevOps team play. As Quang mentioned at the beginning of the call, we see a lot of AI starting to be injected into this process. And I think, like most enterprises, they're a bit overzealous. They have all of these AI tools. There's not a lot of focus on actually how to use them. It doesn't help that the process is already not optimal. And so what we see is just a lot of spinning, as we would call it, or spinning the wheels, as corporate America would call it. And so we do have a couple content pieces coming out next week or the week after around how AI is starting to help with this and how to think about it in more of a deliberate, kind of systematic way. All right, I'm going to pause there. I talked for about 7-8 minutes, so I'm going to give the audience a chance to respond. So for our next poll, I'm curious how many of you are involved in all 4 functions. And it could be you either own it, or you participate in, or you have some level of visibility into either the market planning, territory design, quota setting, headcount planning, compensation.
And Carmen, can you just remind us TAM, SAM, and SOM? What do those acronyms stand for?
TAM, SAM, and SOM. Yeah, normally in a corporate environment, you really hear TAM. Everyone uses TAM, and it's sort of kind of the catch-all for it. But TAM is basically, hey, if we could have 100% of every customer buying in this, like this is what TAM would be. SAM is, generally where, excuse me, SAM is generally where you kind of whittle that down based on sort of like a competitive analysis. Like, hey, I start a new brand of water, right? And there's a $6 billion market for water. There's a lot of established competitors, right? I'm probably going to capture a very small part of that. And then from there, SOM is more about, your positioning, who you want to go after, right? Companies aren't if you're HubSpot, right? I know, or Gong as an example, I think we have a few people from HubSpot and Gong on. You're not going to go after every single customer, right? You may over-index on mid-market or SMB or enterprise. And so, you might start with a $10 billion market opportunity, and it might be 150 million by the time you kind of assign all that. But what's important about that, as we'll get into, is that's really easy to do at a high level, right? It's really easy to say the market opportunity globally is X, or in the US, it's Y. It's a lot more challenging when you have 75 reps and you need to distribute that opportunity in a way where the territories are going to be unbalanced, but they reflect the market opportunity in the way that you measure it. So whether it's at a market level or it's at maybe a vertical level, or it could be both, that's really the challenge here. And so I see a few people appreciate the comments. So yeah, Brenda, it is a big company. Thomas, love to hear about, the visibility there. You all have a unique perspective because of the insights that you all have. So I'm sure that cycles into your planning process. Yep. And then Christine, yeah, sales management decides territories and headcount, executes. Yep. Yeah. And the territories and the headcount, that's interesting. I would be curious. It's not a poll, but what we have generally seen is sales managers will decide territories and headcount, often in partnership with like a go-to-market ops team or sales ops team. But I've also seen it where sales ops exclusively decides territories and headcount, and it's in partnership or consultation with sales management. So I'm curious, does anyone of those two models, curious what your company does or what you've seen, or maybe just general comments on the topic? Comp piece. Okay. We'll see why it's important in a moment. Quang, if you go to the next slide. All right. The revenue planning excellence frameworks, as all good consultants are. We love frameworks and we love naming them things. And we're no different, right? But this is our framework. So I've sort of grayed out the market assessment and the governance because even though they're central and core to the process, they're sort of secondary in terms of the focus today. So really the way to look at it is think about it from a cascade perspective. So we have the process flow, right? Which we saw in the earlier slide. So step 1 is this, step 2 is this, step 3 is this, step 4 is this. Now it's, okay, well, what do each of these domain areas need to do? And then how do they work together? So strategic market assessment, we talked a lot about, you need to understand what the market opportunity is, and it needs to be reasonable and representative. And this is where it gets challenging because as someone who mentioned earlier, the CFO versus the CRO, if you're a CFO, you absolutely obviously want to make as much money as you can. And I know that sounds obvious, but it's obvious for a different reason. It's because you might have a break-even point that just, if you don't hit it, you can't cover your fixed cost. Or you might be in a highly leveraged industry, like say, I used United before, airlines. It makes sense for an airplane to sell every seat because 95% of their cost structure is fixed, right? So, you want to have as high of revenue as you can. And of course, the CRO wants, to grow revenue, but the CFO is looking at it from a leverage perspective, which in some cases means that if you grow your revenue 1%, depending on your cost structure and your contribution margin, you might have that every 1% of revenue growth translates to 5 or 6% of profit, right? And so as a sales leader, and again, like I know this might seem obvious, but it's not. Sales leaders are not generally incentivized on profit. They're incented on growth, whereas CFOs are generally incented on profit. So there is an inherent conflict there. It may not seem obvious, but there is, and it's often one that manifests in this process and in any time we do compensation or anytime we do planning. And so it's an important distinction that goes into territory design, right? If you have a number for a geo that is, in your estimation, right, in a top-down, bottoms-up planning approach, 20 or 30% too large for the geo, or you're a sales leader looking at this like, there is no way we'll ever come close to this. Well, now you have to divide that up. And so now you're giving someone a quota that you probably know is not really all that obtainable. And if it is, it's not sustainable. It'll lead to burnout. And so when you build the territories, it is important to have line of sight into those differences at a market level or a region level or a vertical level, because if you're given that number, you can carve it up in a way that isn't just a sort of peanut butter spread or in a way that makes sense. And then that further cascades. So you can see there's this sort of buildup. When you get to the quota setting, almost all companies assign some sort of overassign. Now that overassign, as we'll see in later slides, is generally the result of attrition, headcount, and like turnover inefficiencies. If you're a sales leader, you might at any given time have 15, 20% of your headcount open, right? Or maybe more if you have a smaller team. So you need an overassign to protect you. Well, that compounds the issue. If you already have territories that are unbalanced and not reflective of opportunity, now you add 10, 15% of an overassign, and it exacerbates the problem. And then you get into headcount and capacity planning. Now, this is where things usually start to break down. Capacity and headcount planning, generally it's a sales ops, rev ops kind of function. And it's not really done in the way that ties back to how sellers sell. The way that capacity and headcount planning typically happens is it's just based on a productivity multiplier. We know that if you're an SMB or mid-market or enterprise, you have to hit a certain productivity number, right? So your cost has to be 6% or 8% of sales. And so you have to factor that in. But the challenge with that is it doesn't reconcile to an activity-based capacity planning model, which means, okay, if I'm a seller, and I'd be curious, like if for those of you that have been in a sales role or in a sales role, I'd love your thoughts on this. If you're a seller, it's just simple math. You have maybe 1,200 hours a year where you can be selling, right? There's a number of hours you're doing other things. So if you think about all the activities you do at an account level, let's say you're an enterprise seller, you have, QBRs, you have prep for QBRs, you have travel, all of those things. Well, it's just a simple numbers game. If I'm doing all of those things, I have to get X number percent or X percent from my account to be able to do that. Well, the only way that happens is if I work more hours or they spend more. But of course, depending on your industry, what you're selling, there's only so much that you can drive up. This problem also gets exacerbated in consumption-based models as well, which is out of scope, but it's important to know that capacity planning is very difficult when you have consumption-based comp models. So I'm going to pause there. The comp alignment, we'll talk about it in a little bit. Really, the thing there is that the consequence of getting all of those things wrong generally manifest in comp. And I'm sure those of you who've been in a comp role or have been in a sales role can attest to, a lot of times people will say, comp plan's not working. And you dig a little deeper and you're like, well, it's kind of a quota setting issue, right? The OT is competitive. We don't really have attrition that would explain it. It's 30% of our people are hitting quota. So let me pause there. I'm curious. I know we have another slide before this, but I am curious, for those of you that said you kind of work across all of these, which one of these is the biggest pain point? And for those of you that don't, generally in your experience of territory design, quota setting, headcount planning, comp, where do you find the most challenging in the revenue planning process? Yeah, Arvin, marketing. Yeah, that's a good point. Marketing does, depending on the organization, marketing will do TAM and sizing and opportunity. I've definitely seen FP&A as an owner of that. Quang, headcount planning. Michael, retention planning. Yeah, retention planning is tough because you have to account for ramp time. You have to account for a turnover. And there's another team here that, we haven't talked about, which is the talent acquisition team, right? Like you have to source the talent. Now in the US, it's a little bit easier. In EMEA, it can be challenging, particularly if your HQ is in Ireland, where it's heavily saturated, especially if you're in a tech space. But you generally, like what we see in EMEA, is sort of 3 layers of talent sourcing. Layer 1 is home country. Layer 2 is sort of EU, and then layer 3 is the periphery. So like Turkey is an example, even like Algeria, those countries. The problem with it is that, it might take in your home country, it could still take 3 months from start to finish. In the broader EU, it could take 4 to 6 months. And then in that sort of tertiary, sector, it could take, I've seen it take up to 9 months. And so if you have compensation that isn't competitive, or you're not benchmarked properly, that actually is a downstream issue that affects upstream, right? Because you can't necessarily get the talent that you need in the timeline that you need it. Yeah, and Brenda, we'll go into the headcount models and the workbook that we'll send out after. It'll give you, again, like all of those different kind of elements. So I think on that, Quang, let's switch to the, I think we'll skip the next slide, but I want to go to the compensation philosophy. Yep. So this one's important. It seems like this is kind of a little bit, well, why does this matter? And so if you think about it, how does a company pay? It seems like an obvious question, but it's not. There's really 3 entry points to this. How do they pay when they're attracting someone? How do they pay when they're rewarding someone? And how do they pay when they're retaining someone? And there's a budget, right? It doesn't matter if you're, Amazon, well, maybe Amazon's a bad example given the 10% riff, but if you're Microsoft or you're a big company, you have a budget. And the question becomes, do you index that budget to attract people, which means that you have higher base pay, you have higher OTE, or do you index that to reward people, which means that you might have lower OTE, lower base pay, right? The third valence here is the way that you compensate them. And this matters a lot. I know we're kind of starting downstream to move back up, but the reason that it matters is because it does inform how you think about quota setting. It should inform how you think about quota setting. And I think therein lies the problem, is that the teams responsible for quota setting don't think about it this way, but it ladders up to your talent strategy, and it certainly ladders up to your financial goals. So if you say, look, we're going to be a luxury company, we're going to pay people very high, well, you notice that you can't have a lot of differentiation between low performers and high performers. And the way to read this graph is that the low performer is paid somewhere around the 70th percentile of the market, and the high performer at the same company is paid somewhere around the maybe 85th percentile. So that spread is low. But if you look at like a market follower or a seller leave, like Oracle would be a good example. I don't know if they are now, but once upon a time, they very aggressive. So a low performer is going to get paid 25th percent of the market, whereas a high performer is going to get paid 75th percent. So that's an example where you have a budget, you can have high OTEs like Oracle does, and the way that you balance it with the valence of rewarding people is you say, look, if you are an individual seller and you knock it out of the park, we'll give you $1 million. If you don't hit at least 95% of your quota, you get nothing, and then you're gone in 3 months. It's not right or wrong. It's just the culture that they choose. And so it is important because the financial kind of position you take from a budgetary perspective and then from a comp perspective does impact all of this, right? Because you can say, hey, we're a great place to work. We're a market follower. So we're going to give you really high OTE. You attract people because you're like, oh, I'm going to get a 30% raise. But then you realize that the quota setting is such that only 25% of people make quota. So it doesn't matter what your OT is. It doesn't matter what your variable is. So it's a really important slide to orient. And with that, I am curious, we do have another poll. So you don't have to stick to the terminology, but I would be curious, like, what is your company's kind of performance comp philosophy? Do you kind of pay people roughly the same? Is it no, if you get paid really well, or if you don't do so well, you don't get paid anything? So I'd love to hear from the audience. There's a few people I know, so I can always call on folks. Not that I'm going to do that. So Brenda, pay for performance. Yep. So yeah, so Brenda, it sounds like maybe that's the performance period can influence that. You see that a lot in companies, and you see it a lot with more senior roles where they have like annual performance period. So there's just like cumulative payouts, so that like Q3 and especially Q4 is really really good. Marcus, pay for idea of reality is pay higher for most people. Nice place to work. Yeah, Christine, I think nice place to work is, I would say in our experience, Quang, I'd be interested in your take on this, but I feel like of all of these, I feel like market follower and sort of like nice place to work are the two most common. Or pleasant place to work. What do you've done this for, decade and a half. What do you typically see?
Yeah, I think most people, again, these are, to note, they're illustrative, right? I've seen organizations go from that blue line, the market follower, and then invert to sell or leave to really put a lot of upside dollars. And you see that, and particularly in tech, business services, companies that have high growth aspirations are hiring top talent. I would say typically what we see is people that end up in pleasant place to work don't do that by design, because it represents a culture of mediocrity, right? Everyone is paid about the middle. You're not rewarding performers. You're kind of, keeping lower performers afloat, and you get to a place where the sales leaders are like, what the heck is going on? And they complain a lot about not having the right talent. And I think Christine mentioned is like, people don't do this usually by design. They do because there's exceptions, right? They hire someone in, and they might not give them the right territory at the beginning, and so they offset. They give them some concessions. They'll do things on a spiff level to keep everyone happy. But that usually is not a culture that I think people want, again, by design.
Yep. Yeah. I would say that my experience is similar. I think invariably what happens is they start as sort of a market follower, where you do have that distinction between low performers and high performers. And invariably it's sort of that curve flattens a little bit, right? And part of that is because of quota setting. Part of that is just you may not have enough headcount. There's a number of factors for it. I do want to maybe switch gears. I think would be helpful, Quang, if you go. So we said we wanted to make this interactive. I want to just talk real quickly about quota setting and some like key goals with it, and then the capacity planning. And then I do want to show you all the workbook, because I think it'll be a little bit more interactive. On the quota setting, so if you go, Quang, to the data-driven quota setting slide, I think it's a few down. Sorry, y'all. We're very informal in these webinars. There's a lot of movement, so appreciate it. I think what's important here is it sort of amazes me of how wrong companies get this. And I will be the first to admit, like, having been on teams that are responsible for quota setting, that's not a dig in any way. It is really hard to get quota setting right. It's probably one of the hardest things to do, which is no surprise why it's also one of the most important things to get right. And we refer to quota setting as a keystone process. It has wide implications outside of just we did good on quota setting or we did bad. It really can affect your budget, and more importantly, it could affect your talent, right? As for all the reasons we talked about. I think there's a couple of what I want to leave you all here with today when you think about quota setting and the way to sort of practically, inject this into the process, irrespective of where you sit, is to be able to challenge it with confidence, right? I think a healthy degree of skepticism, regardless of the role you play, is really important to get this right. And when we think about quota setting, generally what you want to aim for is roughly 50 to 60, we say 55 to 60% of reps, that's all reps, so that's the direct AEs and that's the overlay roles, will hit or exceed their quota when the company hits plan. And so, of course, that distribution is somewhat normal. And if reps, if the company is, say, 85% to plan, you would expect, maybe only 40% of people to hit their number. And on the opposite side of that, if the company is 110% to plan, depending on how big that number is, you might see, 70% or even 90% in some cases, right? A bigger number, you would probably see closer to 85. With a smaller number, it might be 70. But that's the first point. So the first point is when company hits plan, 50 to 60% of reps should meet or exceed their quota. The second takeaway there is the double click behind that. It's like, okay, well, great, 50, let's say we did that and 60% of people did hit their quota. Well, the distribution now matters. The distribution matters for a number of reasons. It matters for cost, right? If that distribution is heavily skewed to the right, and your average is significantly further than your median, well, now your total cost for that comp program might be 160%. So the distribution matters. Generally, you want to see somewhat of a normal distribution, and you want to have about 2/3 of reps in between 80 and 120-ish%, right? So you're going to have those outliers. It's going to happen. Quota setting is not perfect, but that's the second valence. And I think the last thing that I would say around quota setting, again, why this is important, is you should pay people differently based on their quota size. Not in all cases, but in an enterprise setting or even a mid-market setting, and in some degrees when you're on the upper end of the SMB setting, you do see differentiated performance based on quota size. And so it's important because if you look at it just from a macro level, everyone that hits their quota, it might not necessarily surface bigger issues. And what I mean by those bigger issues is if you don't have differentiated pay, you're penalizing your high performers, right? Because now someone who has a $50 million quota has the same accelerator rate as someone who has a $20 million quota. So even though your quota setting might be perfect, it might hit those guardrails, you're still hurting your top performers, right? And so you can kind of see a part of what we're hoping to get across in this webinar is just how interconnected all of this is. And even though you might not own it or be the what's the acronym, the DRI, the directly responsible individual, it's important to understand how these fit together. So it's always important to kind of approach these stats and these health scores with a bit of skepticism. And it's easier to do that when you understand the sort of underlying mechanics of it and how it connects to other areas. So, Quang, if we can go just real quickly,
Yeah.
I do want to
one
leave.
thing I just before we move on to add, I think I really like Carmen's point about the skepticism, because if you approach it that way, again, whether you own this, you're involved with it, it also allows you to be able to defend it. And I'm not saying that you need to be able to sit down and have the Excel formulas, and I would actually not encourage you share that level of detail. But I, kind of sort of akin it to going to a fancy restaurant, the dish, the ingredients, and you'd be like, yeah, your quota comes with these things, right? These ingredients, this is how you set the number, because ultimately the rep has to believe it and their leader has to believe it, and they have to believe that it's achievable, and it's fair relative to their realities. And that's why the skepticism is so important.
Yep. If you can go to the next slide, we're going to skip to capacity because I do want to leave some time for questions. We're getting, and by the way, thank you all for, I know, sitting for 45 minutes listening to others talk is not always the easiest. So appreciate you all sticking with us now that we're about 3/4 of the way. Really quick on the planning calculator. I made the comment earlier, when we talk about capacity planning and when you ask the question, how do you know how many reps you need? We tend to look at it at a segment level. You should look at it at a segment level, regardless of kind of where you are. There are clear differences in how someone who's an SMB buyer, right, a small, medium business buyer, is going to purchase things as opposed to an enterprise buyer. They have different expectations, different levels of complexity, varying levels of sophistication, varying needs, varying SLAs, right? All of those things manifest in how you service a customer. Now, the capacity planning should happen across the entire sales process, meaning, okay, if I'm an AE, and this is where it's not part of this, but it's important. What type of sales process do you have? So there's a number of them. Broadly speaking, you can kind of think about it in two ways. There's a modularized sales process where, okay, a lead comes in or there's an outbound motion, but either way, there's a, how do we acquire, right, customers? Then how do we close them? How do we service them? So you might have a marketing to SDR, SDR to AE, AE to AM, and then a CSM overlay. All of that is important because that's going to change by segment. It may change by vertical. You may have different coverage models. You might say for finance and insurance, we have, a heavy focus on our AMs such that they only manage 12 accounts versus manufacturing might manage 50. So it does matter, right? That level of granularity is important. But ultimately, the way you can think about it, the way that we recommend doing it, as opposed to solely a productivity number, which is typically where finance index is to say, what are all the things that these people do? Now, you don't have to get to like that detailed. You can like monthly check-ins. Okay, what's involved in a monthly check-in? There's the meeting itself. There might be some internal prep. There might be some coordination with customer science or some sort of insight team or whatever teams are part of that process. So you might say it's about an hour and a half per account. How many times does that happen per year? Well, it's 12 times if it's monthly. And you can see that you back into this and say, okay, so for an account, and this is probably more for sort of like a relationship manager, per account, you're spending 200 hours. Okay. So, you can have 7 accounts if you're about working 1,400 hours. And then that's where you can then back into the territory side of things. If you're in a territory-based model, you can say, okay, we know realistically someone in this role could handle about 7 accounts. The average account right now, baseline, is $1 million. That's 7 million. If we want to do a kind of weighted average growth of 15%, what is that, 7, and then call it another $1 million. So $8 million, that's the quota. And then we over-assign 10%. So what becomes a territory of 7 million in current state now becomes a quota of 8.8 million, right? So we just added $1 million and almost $2 million on the quota from current state. And if, depending on your goal, if it's pure revenue, it's more than that, right? Because if you have a high churn rate, well, now that person needs to make up maybe 2.5 million just to be even, right? And now what exacerbates this is if you don't have realistic numbers in terms of the activity, because if these numbers aren't realistic, you might say a rep can handle 6 accounts. Okay, well, it might seem that that's a better outcome because it's less accounts, but you still have the same problem and you have less opportunity to close the gap, particularly if you just have a churn rate that's in the 20s or the 30s, depending on what you're selling. And so you can see how it quickly becomes problematic, where from a finance perspective, it might be, great, we have 1 rep, they're projected to make 300K, and they're going to bring in 6 million, 20X, right, on an enterprise. Of course, that number's lower when you get to SMB. It's like, yes, from a finance perspective, that makes perfect sense on paper. But the reality is such that the only way for them to do that is to work more hours or to squeeze more money per account. And if you haven't done proper opportunity sizing at an account level, which a lot of companies don't, you're setting someone up for failure. And so that's really the level of scrutiny that we encourage you all to take when you're thinking about the downstream capacity side of things. Is don't just index on the finance kind of cost of sales side of it, really think about it from an activity level, how much time these individuals have, and then calibrate it back to the opportunity, but also understand that that opportunity is going to have probably a 30% uplift by the time all is said and done in terms of the growth and the oversign. So I'll pause there. I don't know, Quang, do we have another? I think we're done for polls. I don't think we have another poll, but yep. I wanted to leave the last 10 minutes. Again, we have a workbook that we're going to send out that I think if you spend even 15 minutes with it, you'll see how things are connected. But yeah, in the last 10 minutes, I want to open it back up to the audience for any questions, comments, thoughts. Would love to hear from you all. All right, there's too many people I know on here that if we were one-on-one, they'd have something to say. Brenda, I was thinking about you and a couple other people. Yeah, I guess maybe I can queue up what's the biggest change you've seen? Yeah, for me, I'll start and then Quang would love your thoughts. And then of course, others would love to hear from you as well. I think what I've seen in planning is I've seen a move towards a kind of center of excellence model. I wouldn't say it's a perfect kind of parallel to a traditional COE, but I've seen RevOps become increasingly, RevOps has increasingly become the owner of a lot of these things. And so what I mean by that is typically, the sales ops org might own quota setting, right? And as we saw from some of the other comments, it could be the sales leaders are responsible for the territories. Well, I've seen that be consolidated into kind of like a single point. And that is great. But I think there's one thing missing here that we haven't talked about. All of this assumes that you have really good data and it's not living in 17 different places. And oh, by the way, those 17 different places, they don't generally talk to one another in the way that they should. And we've seen RevOps teams work and do this quite successfully on building out that sort of like data architecture and that those data foundations. And that's why we've seen it more in the RevOps space. What we're also starting to see is sort of the loose use, I'll call it, of AI. The use cases are prevalent, but the efficacy is mixed. If you read, Gartner has a ton of reports on these that are great. It's, sales leaders or RevOps leaders have 90% confidence that AI is going to make things easier. Well, but when you actually survey them, it's maybe less than a third. I think the stat was 28% said that it actually did, with over 60% saying that it actually made things more difficult. So we have a webinar, funny enough, on November 12th. It's on that very topic, right? It's AI within sales planning and sales operations. So we'll send out the reminder to folks, but definitely encourage you all to join that. Quang, what about you? What's the biggest change you've seen?
I think we mentioned this earlier. We showed that that foundational step process slide. I think the biggest one is a compression of the timeline and planning thought of more of as an ongoing exercise versus like a thing you do once a year. I think all companies are reeling with just being overloaded with more information, more insights, and needing to answer questions real time. So I think in addition to what you're saying, so like one, the consolidation of what used to be like standalone planning teams to like one, call it overarching body, whether it's RevOps or something else, bringing together all the functions. And two, just a compression, right? Like, hey, update the plans quicker, adjust more of the market realities, the signals you're getting from sales and sales ops and others, so that the plan is almost like a living document. And to Carmen's point, that's predicated on having the right data and having the right process, not throwing AI on top of a process that is inherently flawed to start with.
Yeah, and then Vincenzo, you had a good question. The roll up. I've seen generally we call it the CRO org or chief business officer org, or the head of sales, and so usually it depends on the company. So that org could be okay. They have an EMEA leader, they have a NAMER leader, They have, or you can do it at segments, right? You have a SMB leader, an enterprise leader, or mid-market leader, however it works. And those are the core sales teams. But then they also have these foundational teams, which is the like the RevOps org or like an insights org. That's typically the hierarchy that we've seen in other settings. I've seen it. It's less common. Roll into FP&A. Some companies call it strategic finance. So that's those are. But I would say that the sales org is probably the most common. And if you think about it, it makes sense. One CRO that we were working with that I was just speaking to, he has all of what we just talked about. So this entire planning process. He has customer success, obviously all the sales side of it. And then he has the renewal org, and he also has marketing. So like a true CRO has pretty much, I mean, at that point, he's almost singularly running the business, right? So it just depends. Smaller companies, you'd see that maybe wider scope. Bigger companies, larger companies, it might be a bit more narrow. Brendan, so we got a couple more. I'll kind of work backwards. Yeah, Brendan, we'll send out the deck. There's also the quota guide. We have a workbook that we'll send as well. And then what we'll also do is include a link to, we're hosting a webinar November 12th, I believe. I think it's 1 p.m. Central, that talks about now the use of AI and technology within the planning process. So we'll send that out as well. And if you don't attend that one, totally fine. You'll still get a copy of it. But this way you have it. Let's see, a couple last minute. Have you worked with a company that is over maximum achievement and wants to be? So Marcus, yeah, it's funny you say that. We're working with one right now. That's literally, it's sort of funny. The challenge that they have is a bit unique, where their distribution, we talked about quota distribution. It truly is this sort of, it's kind of bimodal in a way, but we would call it like maybe a bathtub distribution, where you have a high percentage of people making virtually nothing, and a high percentage of people making a whole bunch of money. And so it's an inequity in a different way, but that is a good example of how quota setting gets you to a point where you're not hitting your number, and you're paying people more than 100% of their variable for not even hitting 100% of their target. And that is a direct consequences of the marketing side and the territories. And then it just sort of continues to build with, if the territories are wrong, the quotas are wrong. If the quotas are wrong, it's impossible to achieve. If it's impossible to achieve, people leave. If people leave, you lose that knowledge. So you can kind of see it builds. All right. I think that's all the questions.
Marcus had another question, Carmen. Is data-driven quota setting industry-based or across all industries?
So in my experience with this, I would be shocked if you ever heard anyone that's responsible for setting quotas say that they're not data-driven. Everyone is data-driven, right? And to an extent they are. It's not, and that's where I think that term becomes illusory. Yes, you're data-driven, and your process for being data-driven may be correct, but it's not. It's correct in the sense that you've set your own goals, right? So the standard of success is what you want it to be, and that's wrong. The standard of success should be all those other things. It should be, is your quota setting correct in terms of who achieves quota? Is the distribution correct? Are people being paid according to your philosophy? Do you have attrition, the non-regrettable attrition that's in line to where your talent strategy is? Can you recruit people? Are you making, the financial return that you need to make? That is the true measure of success. And often what happens is quota setting is just measured, okay, did we hit our number or not, right? And everything else becomes sort of secondary. And hopefully you see why that's problematic. I would say on the data-driven side, though, where it is data-driven, it's, okay, here's our baseline. We're going to add 10% to it. I don't know if I'd call it data-driven, but that is unfortunately what we see quite a bit. All right. I think we're at, Goldcast is telling me we have 35 seconds left. And so I just want to say a final, I still see about 35 or so people on. So just want to say a final thank you for all those that attended. Really appreciate you spending an hour with us. Hopefully this was helpful to you, informative to you. Like I said, we have a couple things we'll follow up with you. And of course, if there's ever any questions from you all, or you just want to pick our brain, more than happy. We love talking about this stuff, and we would love to hear from you.
Take care all, and have a great Halloween. Cheers.
Cheers.